Ukraine has begun using Western long-range missiles inside Russia for the first time. President Putin has responded by launching a new hypersonic weapon. What next for the war in Ukraine? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, the war in Ukraine has entered a new phase as American-built missiles have been fired into Russian territory. The UK supplied Storm Shadows, and they're also believed to have been used. The escalation comes after President Biden gave Ukraine the green light, just weeks before he leaves the White House.
The moment Russian hypersonic missiles rain down on Dnipro, Ukraine. This, the first time Russia has used an Oreshnik weapon capable of carrying a nuclear warhead. The strike, a warning to Ukraine and the West after President Biden gave the go-ahead for the use of US long-range missiles into Russian territory. British Storm Shadow missiles are also believed to have been used inside Russia. Vladimir Putin, who recently lowered Russia's threshold for using nuclear weapons, made another veiled threat to the West.
In response to the use of American and British long-range weapons on November 21st of this year, the Russian armed forces launched a combined attack on one of the facilities of the Ukrainian defense industry complex. We consider ourselves entitled to use our weapons against the military facilities of those countries that allow their weapons to be used against our facilities.
Ukraine has put on public display fragments found from the hypersonic attack. President Zelenskyy is urging world leaders to respond to Russia's latest attack on Dnipro.
Тому світ повинен звучати серйозно.
The world must sound serious in response, to make Putin really afraid of expanding the war and feel the real consequences of his actions. True peace is achieved through strength.
Donald Trump's election victory has prompted urgency in Ukraine's military efforts. Trump has promised to bring the war to an end, raising serious concerns over how long Kiev can count on Western support. Will the launch by Ukraine of Western-made missiles into Russia push the world closer to the brink?
Well, let's meet our guests in New York City. We have Enda Brady. He's communications director at the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America. In Cambridge, in the UK, Paul Ingram. He's research affiliate at the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk. That's at Cambridge University. And I'm delighted to say here with me in the studio, we have Sean Bell. He's a military analyst and retired British Air Vice Marshal. You're all very welcome to Roundtable, gentlemen. Sean, I'll come to you first. The Storm Shadow missiles, much heralded, much hyped, that the British have now been given the clearance for the Ukrainians to use. Talk me through this weapon system. Is it a game changer?
Bluntly, it's not, no. I mean, this missile's been around for 30 years. We bought about 1,000 of them 30 years ago. We used about 200 on operations. We wanted to upgrade about 300 recently. That left 500 that were, what are we going to do with them? Pay industry to get rid of them, or potentially then donate them to Ukraine. Now, that wouldn't underplay. They are very effective, but they are subsonic. They have a limited payload, but they're very good at very high accurate at getting to their target. But if I asked you what your mobile phone looked like 30 years ago, that's an example of the sort of rate of technology that we're looking at. So these are not going to be game changers, 150 miles, but they do give Ukraine a really interesting capability to target behind Russian lines, target logistics, headquarters, things like that.
So these are 30-year-old weapons?
Yes, the guidance system is, but let's face it, the explosive charge hasn't really changed over many years. It's how you get that explosive to the target. And the one thing that's very good, they're very accurate. They have a number of different ways of getting to their target, and they are very, very effective at doing so. But they're not the state-of-the-art modern technology, and therefore they're unlikely to be a game changer. And frankly, Ukraine's had them for the last year. They've been using them very effectively. We've seen them in Crimea targeting the Russian headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet there. So I'm not quite sure how many they've got left. But those and the ATACMS from the Americas certainly give Ukraine a bit more flexibility.
Andre, give us your take on Ukraine using these weapons, and as we've seen in the last week or so, on Russian soil for the first time.
Well, I think the key thing is that Ukraine is actually doing something to affect change to get it to the place that everybody else keeps calling for some kind of negotiation. So the more Ukraine is able to be supported in that way, whether it's the Storm Shadows, the Tauruses, the Attackums. It's not just giving material over to Ukraine, which the United States is hopefully doing by the end of the year before the new administration, but it's also giving these permissions that have just rightly been mentioned. Ukraine has been using these weapons for a long time already. The fact that they haven't been able to use them all across the battlefield is a big problem. And it demonstrates the problem with this entire conflict, which is the largest country in the world has been dictating specifically what the area of battle will be. The West has never confronted Russia upon all of its borders. We have never deployed numerous battle groups out in the Northern Sea, out in the Eastern Seas. It has only been the specific area of battle where Ukraine has had to play defense, which is why it finally went on the offense earlier this year, an unexpected offense that has now lasted close to 5 months of occupying Russian territory, which will, in the end, once we get to the table, be extremely beneficial for Ukraine's position, which in general is the West's position.
Paul, just talk to me about the danger of escalation here. What does it mean, the use of storm shadows?
Well, before I address the storm shadows directly, what I would like to say is that we start this in the context of a very long history between the United States and the Soviet Union and then Russia, which is an understanding that two nuclear weapon states do not go into direct conflict with one another, because most of the games that were played, strategic games, that involve the release of nuclear weapons then deteriorate into an all-out exchange. So that's what we're trying to avoid here, and I think the Biden administration has been very cognizant of that danger all through this conflict and has been very cautious about any move that could be interpreted as a direct conflict between NATO, the United States on the one hand, and Russia and the Russian Federation at the other. And of course, as we have gone through this conflict step by step, we have got closer to that point, and this is another step in that direction. How we analyse how close a step or how big a step it is in that direction, I think, is an interesting point of conversation that we're having today. But it is a step in that direction of direct confrontation.
Sean, talk to me about the Russian response then, because they've now come back with a new weapon that we hadn't previously seen.
Yeah, but they have, the Oreshnik, which was much vaunted. We saw some video on Thursday morning last week. Lightning streaks coming down from the sky. It looked almost sci-fi, really. But the harsh reality was that this was an intermediate range ballistic missile, range of about 3,100 miles. Apparently, you can have 6 to 8 warheads. Generally, you'd have nuclear warheads. This one had literally conventional warheads. But I think you've got to be really careful here. So an experimental missile. There's much vaunted about being Mach 11 times the speed of sound. But of course, remember, that's only when it's outside the Earth's atmosphere. These things in their terminal phase have to go through the thick Earth's atmosphere and slow down a lot. That's when they become most vulnerable. But the 3,100 miles, which was something Russia was pushing very hard, playing to Paul's point, was very much just a message to Europe, you're all within range. And the challenge is, I've got grey hair like yours, but I served in the Cold War. We've always been under the range of former Soviet missiles, now Russian missiles. That's nothing new. This is all part of Putin's rhetoric to tell everybody to back off. You know, we're serious about escalating if you continue. That's what that attack was about.
So what happens next then with the escalation if it keeps going that way? What do you think will happen next?
Well, there's a tactical answer to that and the strategic. I'll do a quick tactical answer. One of the challenges of the West is we might well have military capability that can shoot those missiles down. The trouble is we don't generally like to field it too quickly. You remember the Gulf War? First time we saw the F-117 Nighthawk fighter. It was a Delta Black fighter, first of the stealth aircraft. That had been in service for 10 years, but America kept it hidden. We don't like to showcase this stuff. And if you were to put our state-of-the-art air defense systems like THAAD, latest generation of Patriot, the danger is the Chinese are watching, the Russians are watching, that risks compromising our own capability at home. But turning to your strategic point, the problem here is that ultimately we never stood up to Putin. And the danger is he's now using his nuclear capabilities as a shield and allows him to go rampaging around. And if it doesn't stop, if we don't confront him here, when Iran gets nuclear weapons, when North Korea gets nuclear weapons, who knows what state the earth will suddenly become, because we will be scared to confront that. And I do think it's a bit like a school bully. Nobody wants to confront them, but if you don't confront them when they confront somebody else, who's going to help you when they confront you? And eventually, people like Putin respect strength. They don't respect weakness. And I think we're seeing that on the battlefields today.
Paul, just come in on that point then. How do you think this is going to pan out in the next few weeks and months?
Well, it's very difficult to tell, and of course, Trump is the great disruptor here, and we've had very strong signals that the incoming Trump administration wants to resolve this conflict very quickly, and absolutely no indication of how they would go about it. I think it's interesting that we have the incoming National Security Advisor, Waltz, actually agreeing with the Biden administration in its decision to give permission and to assist in the targeting of the Storm Shadows and the ATACMS. But I do think it is there's greater complexity than just standing up to a bully. I do think that we do need to be very cautious about the inexorable escalation ladder that we could easily just get on to if we confront directly the Russian Federation. Now, Putin knows that, and Putin has been playing us. I don't disagree with that at all, but I think it's more complex than just simply squaring up to Putin, because whilst we are more powerful militarily, and if there were an outright confrontation between NATO and Russia, the Russian Federation would come off extremely badly.
Andre, talk to me about January and Donald Trump becoming president of the United States again. What do you think that will mean for the war in Ukraine?
Well, it's good that you bring up January, because we just heard that there's an incoming national security advisor. That is a person that does not need to be Senate approved. So from the very first day, the NSA will start being staffed up and be really the lead in setting policy. So having Mike Waltz, who, as we just heard, is somebody who has publicly stated that we need to ramp up support for Ukraine, and that flows in line with the goals of the Trump administration to want a negotiation. He's pitching that you need to make sure that Ukraine has a good tactical advantage, so that when you come to the table, the tone can be reached, not just allow Russia to run roughshod over Ukraine. The other side of the foreign policy is Marco Rubio, senator, longtime member of the United States Intelligence Committee in the Senate. So he's been privy to classified information for at least a decade. And of all the nominees that have been mentioned by President Trump, he's somebody that the Senate, given the fact that the State Department head needs to be approved by the Senate, he is a position that the Senate has already telegraphed that he will be able to start on day one because of their approval of him as a nominee. So that bodes well internationally. That bodes well, especially for Ukraine. These are two individuals who've supported arming Ukraine further. And that'll be the head start that Ukraine has. This is very different than what happened at the beginning of the Biden administration, wherein you had a long delay for the approval of Anthony Blinken to be the Secretary of State for the United States. And that allowed somebody in the guise of a Jake Sullivan, who's been very cautious about doling out weapons. He was the one who led policy from the very beginning of the Biden administration, which led to, possibly conflicts, the mistakes happening in Afghanistan, the decisions not to sanction Russia for going ahead with Nord Stream at the very beginning. So we will see a different type of beginning, where we see the NSA and the State Department work hand in hand going forward in January.
So, Sean, on the face of it, these appointments are very good news for Ukraine, would you say?
I try and keep clear of American politics here. I think when I look at it more generically, President Trump, he is a lot of rhetoric. We don't actually know what he's going to do. Some of it is quite scary, but actually there are some things that, whilst the way he transmits the message may be a bit difficult sometimes. For example, with NATO, he wanted to get NATO partners to actually start paying their way. In a country that does pay their way, there were only a third of the countries in NATO actually paying their 2%. And actually, that means those of us who are subsidising those who are not. And I think that's fundamentally wrong. Since that rhetoric has started, 2/3 now pay their way. Also, he's very much made clear that actually Russia really should be more of a European problem and China probably more of an American problem. Does it mean he's going to abandon Europe? Probably not. Does it mean that Europe probably needs to, they feel the heat's more about Russia? Should we be actually stepping up and doing more? So I do think there's a lot of things to look very positively. I do think the one big difference, though, is Biden has been very clear, I don't want to lose the war, whereas Trump is, I don't want the war to continue. That is very different policy-wise. And I'd be really interested because we could spend a lot of time looking at how on earth Trump actually imposes a solution. The only way, really, he can probably do that a little bit with Ukraine. The only way he's going to be able to do that with Putin is to provide a lot of concessions that will stick in the throat of many. I do take Paul's point that we've got to navigate to a peace. But if you end up rewarding Putin for his actions, the implications of that for our global security are profound.
So we're heading towards the third anniversary of this war at the end of February. Do you think this genuinely is a priority for Trump, that he can come in and be the big man and say, I brought them to the table and I've sorted out a peace?
Well, I'd be less focused on the individual. I'd be more focused. I went out to Ukraine about a month ago, and I thought I'd see that same element of resilience and determination, stoicism. But you only have to walk into Maidan Square and see tens of thousands of flags fluttering. The price of this war has been huge on Ukraine. And there's this sense of weariness. Rather than that sense, we're going to prevail. You know, now there's this sense it's got to come to an end. And I do sense that actually President Trump is probably sailing with the wind at the moment. I'm not for one moment saying it's not going to be an incredibly difficult time for President Zelenskyy and how you navigate your way. But if President Zelenskyy can secure some form of security guarantees, not a signature like the 1994 Budapest memo, but something credible, and if they can also secure the money to help them rebuild their country, then I think potentially there's something to look forward to.
Paul, this would be a huge win for Trump, wouldn't it, if in the first weeks of his presidency he managed to get them to the table and even begin negotiations?
Yes, it would, and I would just add to that analysis that we have to be cautious about seeing Europe as very strongly behind the continuation of the war as well. There is exhaustion there, and politically, and we see the rise of the far right and many candidates in several European states that are far less supportive of Ukraine. And those countries like Britain and France that have been very supportive have very significant economic problems back at home. So I cannot see the Europeans in a place where they are going to step into the shoes of the Americans and fill the financial gap. So I think there's a lot of mood in all countries, including Ukraine, for some kind of a resolution. Now, looking at it from the Russian perspective, they are making gains on the battlefield at the moment. I think they probably feel quite confident, and that makes a resolution more challenging.
Andre, just come back on the whole issue of war weariness. 3 years of a long, brutal, terrible war. Have the Ukrainian people got the fight still in them? I mean, or are they prepared now to sit down and talk peace, even if it means giving up huge tracts of their country?
Well, first, I'm going to acknowledge that there have been public polling demonstrating that more and more people are open to that last proposal of yours, some kind of negotiation. However, Ukraine is a much different country now than it was from the beginning of the war. We have millions of people who are living outside of it. And the question of where exactly is their home is something that is going to have to be figured out. 10 cities of 100,000 population or more have been completely leveled since the beginning of the full-scale aggression. Is Mariupol their home if it doesn't physically exist? I don't know. So there's a lot of questions about what Ukraine is going to do in 2025, even if peace were to come in an instant. Opening airports takes at least 6 months of hiring and figuring how to staff up those facilities. How do you vote in a country where, again, I mentioned, what is your residence? My residence doesn't exist. So there's a lot of questions for Ukraine to figure out. But in the end, for people who have lost almost everything, and almost everybody in Ukraine has personally lost a friend, a family member, they know people who have either been irrevocably changed or have been lost forever. And the one issue that doesn't get addressed with any of this rhetoric is justice for Ukraine. And that when we talk about some kind of negotiated resolution, for all that I'm understanding, this is a negotiation to stop missiles coming in, or as with last night, 188 Shahed drones, bombarding Kyiv. That's what we're talking about being negotiated. We're not talking about the sanctions that need to be kept on Russia so it collapses. We're not talking about any of the international cases of war crimes, and Putin should never be allowed to visit a country that's a part of the ICC. So there's a lot of justice that still needs to be addressed, and that's a long-term issue. We can just look at what happened in World War II and how long it took for a conflict that lasted less long than the occupation of Crimea. And many of those art objects that were stolen are just now still being rediscovered. What is the case for Occupy Crimea, Occupy Donetsk, and everything that was looted from those territories? We're talking about a long-term resolution to a conflict that never should have started. And in the end, what will really benefit the people of Ukraine is not just a ceasefire, not just an ironclad guarantee of their safety, but some measure of justice. And that will have to be a part of any international discussion going forward.
Sean, Andre mentioned the bombardment of Kyiv in recent days. That has always been the prize for Putin, isn't it? To hammer Kyiv and basically batter the Ukrainian people into submission that way.
Well, to be honest, it's not entirely clear why he's doing it. I mean, Kyiv is an absolutely beautiful city, and you would imagine from here that it must feel like the Blitz in London in the Second World War. When I was there, my first morning there, I walked around, had a cup of coffee, didn't see any. I spent an hour, didn't see any buildings that were damaged. Now later, I got driven around, and there clearly are some damage to the buildings, but it remains a beautiful city. It means all the shops are full, therefore the challenge. That's the head of power. But I think Russia has largely tried to switch tacks now. It's looking more tactical gains. I think what's interesting is it does seem to, when in the early days it was hitting the energy infrastructure to make life as miserable as possible for Ukrainians. I think that's probably still the case, but the industrial base, particularly the defense industrial base of Ukraine, President Zelenskyy famously said, I want to build 1 million drones a year. Undoubtedly, that has been very successful. And I think part of the Russian strategy now is to try to take out as many of those industrial, because drone warfare never really featured before this. But the Ukrainians, both tactically, little handheld drones, but also more strategic drones, they've been very effective at, and of course, therefore, we started the program talking about Storm Shadow, long-range strike. Ukraine's actually developed quite a lot of its own weapons that can do long range now to stop it having to be reliant on this sort of slightly shaky international support. So, Ukraine, I think Kyiv will still remain strong. My last thought on that, though, was when I was being interviewed recently by a Ukrainian television channel. At the end of it, they sounded very downbeat about the prospects and said, if we lose, what's this all been for? And I had to pick them up and say, right, stop. As an analyst, at the start of this war, we didn't give Ukraine much of a chance at all. There were 40-mile convoys. We thought Russia would prevail. Through the bravery, tenacity, stoicism, sacrifice of Ukrainians, you at least have part of the country left. And whatever history writes about this, in the future, generations will be proud of the sacrifice and the effort and tenacity of the Ukrainian people. So whilst today it feels awful, I do think the legacy will be a very proud Ukraine, an independent Ukraine. We just got to navigate our way to that future.
Paul, just final point. I mean, as we head towards Christmas now, it will be a very different Christmas again for the people in Kyiv. Are we reaching a stage now where you genuinely feel we get into early 2025 and there will be peace talks?
I hope. I'm sure everybody hopes. And I do think that there is that distinct possibility. I think in a funny sort of way, the story of the escalation from last week, the agreement to use the missiles, the Russian response, the clear escalation steps that have been taken, in a sense, they could be seen as a signal that both sides are working up towards this point where Donald Trump comes in and starts putting proposals on the table and presumably starts threatening both sides with sanctions if they don't sit at the table.
Andre, final point to you. Just tell me how you're feeling as we approach Christmas, the end of the year, and hopefully at some point in 2025, peace talks.
Well, first of all, it's been a long delay to get to this point. We can talk about the fact that the decision was made to finally allow Ukraine to have limited strikes in a small area of Russia. There's a lot of Russia to target. I wish the United States and our Western partners wouldn't do the drip, drip, drip that's got us to this place. And it's not just one response to the other. Obviously, the West contemplated making these changes when North Korea was introduced onto the battlefield. But as we've been talking about the possible positives of the Trump administration appointments and how they can actually help Ukraine's chances and ramp up their attacks to get them to the negotiating table, we haven't mentioned the fact that there is a large element of chaos that's going to begin coming from the United States, in the middle of January. And from day one, the United States has already announced that there will be a specific tariff assigned to its allies. So the worldwide economy is going to be in chaos. The United States economy will be therefore also in chaos, and we don't know what that chaos will lead to.
Andre, thank you for answering my questions today, and to Paul and Sean as well here in the studio. Thank you all. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all of the team here, goodbye, and thank you for watching.